The question itself burns like acid, crawling through the mind of any who dare to ask it. To rot, yet breathe. To bleed, yet feel no pain. To watch your flesh turn to sludge and still call it life, that is the curse of the Death Guard. They were not always monsters. Once, they were men, proud, unyielding warriors of the Great Crusade, led by their father, Mortarion, the grim and silent Primarch of Barbarus. They marched beneath the banner of the Emperor of Mankind, bringing order to worlds drowning in filth and tyranny. Their creed was endurance, the will to survive where no one else could. They were the bulwark against the impossible, the legion that never faltered. But endurance, like all virtues, can be twisted. Barbarus was a world of poison. Every breath burned the lungs, every step in its toxic mists was a battle against death itself. The people there learned to live with suffering, to make it their companion. From that crucible, Mortarion was forged, and so too his sons. They learned to see pain not as an enemy, but as proof of their strength. The more they endured, the more they believed they were invincible. And that belief would become their doom. Mortarion despised weakness, but his hatred for it was born from his own past. He had been raised by a monster, the cruel warlord who ruled Barbarus, a creature shrouded in armor and corruption. When the Emperor came to claim his lost son, Mortarion saw not salvation, but another tyrant. The seeds of bitterness took root in that moment, deep, unseen, but alive. As the Great Crusade raged across the stars, those seeds began to grow. The Death Guard were unmatched in resilience, but their hearts were heavy with pride. They believed themselves superior, untouched by the weaknesses that plagued other legions. They marched through radiation, disease, and pestilence without flinching. They conquered worlds soaked in death and called it victory. But pride is the sweetest poison of all. When the galaxy split apart in the fires of the Horus heresy, Mortarion's resentment found its voice. The Emperor's dream, the golden promise of unity, had always felt hollow to him. And when Horus whispered of liberation, of throwing off the yoke of the false god on Terra, Mortarion listened. He listened, and he followed. The Death Guard turned their backs on the light of the Imperium, and in doing so, sealed their fate. Yet their damnation did not come swiftly. No, their fall was slow, crawling, suffocating, like rot spreading beneath the skin. When Mortarion led his fleet into the warp, he did so with pride, believing his will would carry them through. But the warp is not kind. It does not obey pride or reason. It hungers. For weeks, or perhaps centuries, time has no meaning there. The Death Guard ships drifted through the roiling madness of the Immaterium. The air turned foul. The flesh of the crew began to blister. The screams of the dying became a constant song. At first, Mortarion believed it was another test, another trial of endurance. But endurance cannot defeat corruption. Disease does not care for pride. And as the plague spread, hope decayed. Some say it began with a single breath, a cough from a serf aboard the flagship Endurance. Others whisper that Nurgle himself watched with amusement, waiting for the moment Mortarion would finally break. Whatever the truth, the Death Guard began to die, slowly, horribly, and without end. The once proud sons of Barbarus found themselves helpless against something they could neither fight nor flee. Their armor melted into their flesh. Their organs liquefied. They vomited black bile and begged for death, but death would not come. And as their suffering reached its peak, a new voice echoed through the rot, soft, gentle, almost kind. The voice of Grandfather Nurgle. He offered them a choice, endless agony and decay, or eternal life in his embrace. And so began the curse that would never end. When every breath tastes like rust and poison, and every heartbeat feels like it's counting down to something worse than death, that was what the Death Guard faced in the heart of the warp. Their ships had become floating tombs. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the corridors echoed with the wet coughs of the dying, and even the strongest among them began to crumble. Their faith in Mortarion faltered. Their Primarch, the one who had conquered death itself on Barbarus, now stood powerless, watching his sons rot away before his eyes. He raged, he screamed, he tried to command the warp as if it were another battlefield. But the Mortarion does not obey mortal pride. It listens only to whispers, and the loudest of all belong to the plague god. The voice of Grandfather Nurgle coiled through their ships like sweet, poisonous smoke. It promised relief. It promised survival. It promised that the pain would stop. All they had to do was accept the gift. And one by one, they did. The first to fall was a captain whose lungs had already turned black. When he whispered Nurgle's name, the coughing stopped. His flesh split open and healed again, alive with crawling life. He laughed through the blood as his brothers looked on in horror. Then another joined him, and another, until laughter replaced screams, and the stench of death became the scent of rebirth. Mortarion resisted. For days, or perhaps years, he refused to kneel. But even a Primarch's will can wither. When the rot reached him, when he felt the weight of 1 billion diseases eating away at his soul, he finally broke. And in that moment of surrender, Nurgle smiled. The warp shook with joy as the pact was sealed. The Death Guard were reborn, not as mortals, but as the Plague Marines, eternal carriers of Nurgle's love. Their armor fused with their flesh, their veins became rivers of filth, and their hearts pumped contagion instead of blood. They no longer feared death, because death had become their companion. What was once agony now brought them pleasure. The screams of decay became hymns of devotion. To Nurgle, suffering was not a curse, it was a blessing. Each boil, each blister, each infection was a reminder that life, even in rot, never truly ends. And so the Death Guard laughed. They laughed as their ships oozed with disease. They laughed as the warp opened before them like a wound. They laughed as they marched under their new banner, the 3 circles of contagion, and swore eternal loyalty to their new god. From that moment on, they were no longer the Emperor's sons. They were the bearers of pestilence, the heralds of decay, and the living embodiment of entropy itself. They would spread Nurgle's gifts across the stars, one coughing world at a time. And yet, beneath all that laughter, one truth festered in the dark corners of their souls. They had escaped death, yes. But in doing so, they had forgotten what it meant to live. When triumph is drenched in filth and laughter echoes through the corpses of 1,000 worlds, that is the life of the Death Guard. They were reborn in the warp, blessed by Nurgle's touch, and sent back into real space as immortal heralds of decay. But immortality is not freedom. It is a chain made of rot and despair. When the Death Guard emerged from the warp, the galaxy had already burned. Horus was dead. The Emperor was a corpse upon a throne. The dream of unity, shattered. The heresy was over, but the curse of the Death Guard had only begun. Their ships drifted into the void, dripping with contagion, their hulls fused with pus and rust. Wherever they went, planets died. Crops withered. Water turned to slime. Cities drowned in plague. Entire populations vanished beneath the weight of disease that had no cure, no mercy, and no end. To the Death Guard, this was purpose. Nurgle's will made flesh. Each breath they exhaled carried new horrors, plagues with names like the weeping pox, the sevenfold rot, and the cough of the grave. Each world they touched became part of the Garden of Nurgle, an eternal bloom of death and rebirth. And at the center of it all stood Mortarion, now a demon Primarch, his wings black with decay, his scythe dripping with pestilence, his body a towering monument to rot. Yet even in his monstrous glory, his soul was not at peace. Because deep within him, a part of the man he once was still remembered the truth. He had wanted to free mankind from tyranny, from the rule of monsters. But now he had become the very thing he once swore to destroy. His laughter was hollow. His victories stank of mockery. And his sons, the Death Guard, no longer fought for freedom or loyalty. They fought because the plague demanded to spread. Because Nurgle's joy depended on their suffering. The Death Guard became wanderers in an endless war, an army that could never die, but could never be redeemed. Each battle they fought was the same: disease, despair, and death. Yet no matter how many times they fell, they rose again, their bodies reknitting with worms and bile. To the Imperium, they were nightmares given form. To Nurgle, they were children playing in the filth of eternity. But among the laughter and rot, there were whispers, faint, trembling, human whispers. Some Death Guard remembered the oaths they once swore to the Emperor. Some wept, though their tears were black and thick with corruption. They envied the dead. They envied the silence. For what is eternity without meaning? What is life, when death refuses to come? And that was their curse, not the rot, not the disease, not the grotesque immortality. The true curse of the Death Guard was the memory of what they once were. With every infection they spread, with every planet they doomed, that memory screamed louder. It clawed at their decayed hearts, reminding them of light long lost. But there was no turning back. Nurgle's embrace was eternal. And so they marched, forever rotting, forever laughing, forever damned. For Mortarion, the answer was yes. The rot was not only in his flesh, it had seeped into his spirit. Centuries after his ascension, as demon and lord of pestilence, there were still nights when the laughter of Nurgle faded, and silence crept into the corners of his realm. In that silence, the memories returned, cold, heavy, and merciless. He saw Barbarus again, the mists, the mountains, the sound of chains clattering in the wind. He saw himself, a child standing beneath the shadow of the warlord who had raised him, choking on poison, his lungs burning as he stared up at a god in armor. That was the moment that had shaped him. The moment he swore no one would ever rule him again. But now, he had become exactly what he hated. A slave, not to a tyrant of Barbarus, but to one far worse. The irony festered within him. It tore at his pride like a rusted blade. The laughter of Nurgle was endless, warm, almost affectionate, but beneath it was control. The same kind of control the warlord once held over him. Mortarion could no longer tell whether he served out of faith or fear. Even his sons, the Death Guard, were no longer his. They worshipped Nurgle with fanatical joy. They prayed to the grandfather for rot, for boils, for new ways to spread disease. They danced in filth and called it devotion. Mortarion watched them and felt nothing but disgust and envy. They had accepted what he could not. They found comfort in the decay. He found only chains. Sometimes he would wander through the festering fields of the plagued planet, where the soil itself pulsed with life and death intertwined. The air was thick with spores and laughter, and the sky oozed with green light. And in that grotesque beauty, he saw the reflection of his own damnation, a world that never died, only decayed. He thought of the Emperor. The one he had betrayed. The one who had come to Barbarus to free him. For so long, Mortarion had hated him, believing the Emperor was another tyrant. But now, as centuries passed and the corruption deepened, Mortarion began to wonder, what if he had been wrong? What if the Emperor's hand had been salvation, not control? That thought, that poisonous whisper of regret, was the one thing Mortarion could not endure. He had conquered 1,000 diseases, survived uncounted plagues, defied the warp itself, but memory was the one infection he could never purge. And so, he buried it beneath rage. He waged war against the Imperium with renewed fury. Each world he infected another wound carved into the corpse of his father's dream. His hatred became his purpose, his justification, his armor against guilt. But even hatred decays. Because hatred, too, is life, and in the realm of Nurgle, everything that lives must rot. The Death Guard followed their Primarch into battle after battle, spreading death across the stars. And while they laughed, while they chanted Nurgle's praises, Mortarion's silence grew heavier. His laughter had died long ago. For deep within him, he knew, no amount of plague, no ocean of death, no empire of decay could drown the truth. He had not escaped the warlord of Barbarus. He had only changed his name. For 10,000 years, the Death Guard had spread their corruption across the stars, a crawling, festering tide of disease that no fire could cleanse. But now, Nurgle hungered for more. His laughter rolled through the warp, and his children stirred. It was time for a grand gift, a plague not of worlds, but of faith. And so began the Plague Wars. The Death Guard descended upon the realm of Ultramar, that bastion of purity and order, ruled by Rebute Guilliman, the returned son of the Emperor. It was here that the old wound would fester anew, brother against brother, both born of the same divine father, now standing on opposite sides of decay and duty. When Mortarion's fleet tore through real space, reality itself seemed to scream. Planets fell under clouds of rot. Skies turned the color of bile. The air became thick with buzzing flies that whispered blasphemies in 1,000 tongues. Where the Death Guard walked, life itself surrendered. But this was more than war, it was Mortarion's crusade of vengeance. Every attack, every plague unleashed was his defiance against the Emperor he still despised. He told himself it was hatred that drove him, that he fought to prove the Emperor wrong, to show the galaxy that his father's light was hollow. But deep down, Mortarion knew. It wasn't hate that burned in him. It was shame. When he faced Guilliman on the fields of Ix, the truth struck him harder than any blade. His brother stood before him, shining with divine light, restored by the Emperor's will. Mortarion saw in Guilliman not arrogance, but compassion, and it sickened him. The battle was brutal. Plague Marines clashed with Ultramarines in a storm of decay and fire. The ground split with the weight of their hate. Mortarion's scythe, silence, carved through the air, releasing waves of pestilence that melted armor and flesh alike. Guilliman's sword burned with celestial fire, cutting through corruption as if striking at the warp itself. And then, for the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor's light touched Mortarion once more. It wasn't the Emperor in body, but in spirit. Through Guilliman, the divine presence of the Master of Mankind surged. The golden radiance cut through the filth, and for a single heartbeat, Mortarion saw himself not as he was, but as he once had been. The boy standing in the mists of Barbarus. The soldier who had fought for freedom. The son who only wanted to save humanity. That vision burned him worse than any flame. The light tore through his soul, exposing every scar, every sin, every moment of weakness. It showed him what he had become, not a savior, not a conqueror, but a vessel of rot. And in that blinding moment, Mortarion screamed. Not in rage, but in grief. He fled back into the warp, his laughter gone, his pride shattered. His armies followed, leaving behind a galaxy scarred by plague and sorrow. But the damage was done. Nurgle had feasted well. His children had spread the rot far and wide. Yet for Mortarion, victory was hollow. The Emperor's light still burned in the corner of his mind, a wound that would never heal. Back in the Plague Planet, Mortarion stood before Nurgle's throne once more. The grandfather laughed and called his child faithful. He showered him with affection, gifts, and endless decay. But behind that laughter, Mortarion heard something else, something he could never silence again. A whisper of the man he used to be. It haunted him through the laughter, through the plague storms, through the silence of eternity. And though he would never admit it, he knew. He had not won. He had only survived, and survival was the cruelest curse of all. That question lingered in the depths of Mortarion's mind, echoing endlessly through the rot that had replaced his soul. He was immortal, yes. No wound could slay him, no weapon could destroy him, no disease could claim him. But immortality is not life. It is repetition, a decay that never finishes. After the Plague Wars, silence returned to the Plague Planet. The Death Guard spread across the galaxy in smaller hosts, each one carrying the legacy of rot to distant systems. But for Mortarion, there was no triumph. There was only stagnation. The Demon Lord sat upon his mountain of decay, surrounded by rivers of filth and forests made of bone. Around him, the air pulsed with the hum of a billion flies. Nurgle's laughter filled the sky like thunder, but Mortarion heard no joy in it anymore. Only mockery. He had conquered everything he set out to destroy, tyranny, weakness, even death itself, and yet he had achieved nothing. He was a god's pet, a prisoner of eternity. Every breath he took spread corruption, but no longer satisfaction. His heart no longer beat in anger or pride, but in weariness. His sons, the Death Guard, no longer questioned their fate. They had long since become living extensions of the plague, their individuality melted away by centuries of devotion. They were laughter and rot given form, hollow shells filled with Nurgle's joy. But Mortarion was different. He remembered. And memory is a cruel disease. He remembered the faces of the humans he once fought to protect. He remembered the look in the Emperor's eyes when they met for the last time, the disappointment, the sorrow, the quiet understanding. He remembered the promise he made to his people on Barbarus, that he would free them from suffering. And now, he realized the truth. He hadn't freed them. He had become their suffering. The Death Guard worshipped decay, but decay is not purpose. It consumes until there is nothing left. Mortarion saw that now, the endless cycle that Nurgle had trapped them in. Spread plague, destroy life, wait for rebirth, repeat. The same rot, over and over, forever. In the depths of his realm, Mortarion wandered through the fog. Each step squelched through the muck, every breath carried the scent of old death. He looked up at the diseased sky and whispered words he hadn't spoken in millennia. I was supposed to end suffering, not become it. No one answered. The flies buzzed louder, drowning the silence, as if to erase his words. Around him, the laughter of Nurgle grew softer, like a fading echo. And for the first time in 10,000 years, Mortarion felt something almost human, fear. Not of pain, not of death, but of meaninglessness. He had killed gods and brothers. He had destroyed worlds. Yet in the end, nothing changed. The universe still rotted, and he was just another instrument of its decay. His immortality wasn't a reward. It was a reminder that some sins can never be undone, and some lives are too cursed to ever end. In that moment, even the rot seemed to slow. The buzzing stopped. The air went still. And Mortarion realized the most terrifying truth of all. He could never die, but he could still fade. Not in body, but in spirit. Forgotten by the galaxy. Replaced by newer monsters. Lost even to memory. The Death Guard would endure, but their Primarch, their father, would become just another shadow in the endless rot. And for a being who once believed he could conquer death, that was the cruelest plague of all. That question haunted Mortarion more than any plague ever could. For the first time since his fall, he dared to think about it, redemption. The word itself was poison, burning on his tongue like acid. It didn't belong to him, not anymore. He had slaughtered billions. He had damned his sons to eternal decay. He had spat upon the light of the Emperor and embraced the rot of the warp. What forgiveness could possibly exist for that? And yet, the thought remained. It began as a whisper, buried deep beneath the endless laughter of Nurgle. A quiet voice, distant, patient, and unrelenting. It did not mock. It did not demand. It simply waited. Mortarion tried to silence it. He drowned himself in war, leading plague fleets against the Imperium once more. Entire systems choked beneath clouds of pestilence, planets blackened by his wrath. But even as the Death Guard laughed and spread their gods' gifts, the whisper followed him, through the plague storms, through the warp, through the silence between heartbeats. Sometimes it sounded like his own voice. Sometimes like the Emperor's. And sometimes, it sounded like the child he once was. The boy who climbed the mountains of Barbarus with lungs full of poison and eyes full of hope. Each time it spoke, the same words echoed. You were meant to save them, Mortarion. He told himself it was a trick. A cruel illusion crafted by the warp. But illusions fade, and this did not. The more he tried to reject it, the stronger it grew. Even Nurgle noticed. His laughter changed, softer now, less joyful. A father's sigh rather than a god's delight. He knew what stirred in his favored child's heart. And though the plague god loved all things that decay, there was one thing he despised above all else: hope. Because hope could cure rot. One day, as the Death Guard prepared to unleash another grand contagion, Mortarion stood upon the bridge of his flagship and felt something he hadn't in millennia: hesitation. The weapon before him would obliterate an entire system, turn it into a festering monument to Nurgle's glory. His lieutenants waited for his command, but Mortarion said nothing. He looked out at the void, the cold stars still shining beyond the filth of the warp, and for a single heartbeat he remembered what it was like to breathe clean air. He remembered the sun, the wind, the sound of his people's voices before the fog of Barbarus drowned them. He remembered what it felt like to fight for something pure. And then the whisper returned. Soft, steady, human. You can still stop this. His clawed hand trembled. His rotted lungs wheezed. And for a moment, just a moment, he almost believed it. But then the laughter came back. Low, deep, endless. It rolled through the ship, through the warp, through Mortarion's soul. Nurgle's amusement filled every corner of existence. My child, the voice of the plague god croaked, warm and suffocating, you were never meant to stop. You were meant to endure. And with those words, the hesitation died. The weapon was unleashed. The system burned. And once again, the Death Guard rejoiced. But Mortarion felt nothing. No triumph. No pride. Only the faint echo of what could have been, fading into the rot. He knew now that redemption wasn't denied to him because it was impossible. It was denied because he himself could never accept it. And so, he marched on, not because he believed in the rot, but because he no longer believed in anything else. For 10,000 years, Mortarion had called it a curse. He had blamed the Emperor for pride, Nurgle for temptation, and fate for cruelty. But as eternity stretched before him like an endless plague, he began to understand a darker truth, that his torment was not punishment at all. It was consequence. In the stillness of the plague planet, Mortarion wandered alone through the gardens of his god. Around him, the soil bubbled with life that was not life. Trees wept pus. Rivers ran thick with mucus. Every breath carried 1,000 spores. This was his paradise, his domain, yet it felt hollow, lifeless, cold. The laughter of Nurgle had quieted. His sons were scattered across the stars, spreading decay in their father's name. But Mortarion remained, motionless, surrounded by silence thicker than the rot itself. And then, through that silence, came a voice. Not from the warp, not from his god, but from within. Was this freedom? The words came from the boy he once was, the child of Barbarus, the one who climbed mountains of poison to reach the light. Mortarion saw him standing there in the mist, small and frail, with eyes that burned like dying stars. You wanted to save them, the boy said. You wanted to end suffering. But you never understood it, did you? You thought suffering was weakness. You never saw that it was what made them human. Mortarion stepped forward, his armored boots sinking into the living mud. I gave them strength, he rasped. I gave them endurance. I made them unbreakable. The boy shook his head. You made them empty. Silence fell. The fog thickened, and the stench of decay grew heavier. Mortarion looked around at his kingdom, a world that could never die, a garden that could never bloom. Every leaf, every creature, every sound existed in a state of endless rot. He had built eternity out of disease. And only now did he understand that eternity itself was the disease. He knelt, the weight of millennia pressing down upon him. His wings hung limp. His scythe sank into the sludge. For the first time in countless ages, Mortarion felt something break. Not his body, but the thing that had endured even Nurgle's gift. His will. In that moment, he saw everything clearly. Barbarus, the Emperor, his legion, his sons, the laughter, the rot, the endless, pointless endurance. He had wanted to prove that he could never be broken. But in doing so, he had only ensured that he would never heal. The mist swallowed the child. The vision faded. The plague planet groaned beneath his weight. And when Mortarion rose again, there was no triumph in him, no hate, no pride, only quiet acceptance. He looked to the horizon, where Nurgle's garden stretched forever, and whispered, I was wrong. No one answered. No divine laughter. No comforting voice. Only the buzzing of flies, endless, eternal, indifferent. Mortarion turned away and began to walk. Not toward glory, nor toward redemption, but simply forward, as he always had. Because that was the true curse of the Death Guard. Not the rot, not the plague, not even the laughter of their god. Their curse was endurance itself, the inability to stop, the endless march through decay, the immortality that never brings peace. And as long as the galaxy endures, so too will they, spreading the disease of existence, the rot of memory, the infection of eternity. A reminder that sometimes, the greatest punishment is simply to keep going.